Welcome to the episode 44 of Startups Rights. Today, my guest is Sonal Pai. She's an investor at First Spark Ventures. Welcome, Sonal.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Really excited for this episode. I guess before delving into specifics, I'd love to hear about your background and what you do now in your own words. I guess also, what initially sparked your interest in the investment world, and how did your role, because previously I believe you worked at Genentech, shape and evolve that interest?
Yeah, for sure. I can start from the very beginning. I've always had a huge interest in healthcare, just having some issues growing up as a child. I knew I didn't want to go to med school. I don't have the patience for that. So it's kind of finding the right in between. And I was fascinated by the combination of both biology and then traditional engineering disciplines. So I studied bioengineering and neuroscience in undergrad, and then pretty much jumped straight away into the pharma world. I was at Genentech for about 5 years. Started off in a really cool rotational program. We get to see the inner workings of process engineering, manufacturing, and supply chain. So I was there for a bit, working on some new process innovations, and then also did a bit of school at the same time, which was awesome, and got to see a little bit more under the hood on computation. And then I switched over majorly into the commercial side of Genentech. So that was working with sales and marketing. We were working on pipeline assessments. We were working really closely with various stakeholders within business development and commercial teams. Really enjoyed that. And I love Genentech. It is, I think so fondly of it. I think I got a little bit curious on what it was like to be closer to the science and what it was like to be closer to early stage startups in the biotech world. So about a couple years ago, I joined the team at First Spark, and we're a deep tech fund run in the Bay Area in California. And they gave me a unique opportunity to come source both in Europe and the US while I was in London and look at really cool innovations at the intersection between biology, computation, and hardware. So all of the investments we do are deep tech first and foremost, but heavily tied into the biotech world. And we usually write seed or Series A checks. So yeah, that's kind of me and where I'm at. This is my last week in London before I head back to the States on Sunday, actually.
Very cool background, Sonal. And, especially because of your background, also like the focus of the fund you just mentioned, I believe you do a lot of investments in the computationally focused biotech startups. And we're seeing more and more of those startups right now. Do you think best founders in this space come from sort of like deep academic science or engineering computation backgrounds, or just hybrids are becoming the norm? And do you ever notice any friction sort of between this biology first versus software first teams?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're seeing a new paradigm where these folks who are excellent in both disciplines are the ones that are rising to the top. And London is a really great ecosystem. London, San Francisco are probably the top two that come to mind, where folks are fluent in both biology and computation or in hardware. To speak to your point, though, isn't necessary for them to have a deep academic background. This is actually an interesting case I've observed, especially while being in Europe, is that the academic co-founders are amazing. They don't necessarily have the CEO superpowers. And so I think they're amazing co-founders and CSOs. They've got the deep technical knowledge, but you do probably want someone who's been in the business development world or been selling products to pharma or to large med tech companies to be in that CEO business type of role. So I think that's an interesting phenomenon, especially in Europe, where you do heavily index on the technical skills, which are very necessary, but the business acumen is equally as necessary to grow a really interesting company in this space. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does answer my question. And you're right. Like London, I think Leighton Labs was they raised like a lot of funding, and so he was an alumnus of the DeepMind. And one thing I noticed though, like some of the startups start with more like lean funding initially, and some of them require a lot of upfront investment. And I feel like I was actually doing my dissertation on that. That in Europe, one of the struggles is this long-term patient capital, especially for more growth stage long-term investments. Usually companies end up turning to US funds to get the investment. How do you, since by the nature of the startups, the deep tech startups obviously require more initial investment, because you can also do like MVPs, this lean method where you can just like do prototype tests and iterate and come up with a new thing. When you do those, considering taking into consideration that factor, how do you analyze those investment decisions and compare their kind of risk reward profiles?
Mhm, mhm. Could you clarify a bit between, maybe repeat the question one more time just so I'm understanding the full
Yeah, yeah.
gist?
So what I'm trying to say is, like, some of the startups in the space can start relatively lean,
Mhm.
while others require like massive
Sure.
upfront investments. So
Mhm.
how do you compare them and analyze those investment decisions and their risk reward profiles? Essentially, what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're speaking to two very different business models entirely. And this is actually the new age of tech bio startups that are emerging now. I think traditionally they've always been asset focused, and they are going to require a lot of upfront. There's just no way you can get around that if you're building a therapeutic product. And if a company tells you they can do it leanly, it's probably not a very smart paradigm to actually get to clinic and have successful outcomes with your clinical studies. I think the companies that are now aiming to be more of a services model, whether that's a data services model, even Leighton Labs, for example, they don't have their own pipeline. They're working as a
Mhm.
SaaS model for other companies. So that's where it gets a little bit more interesting, right? That's where you have a little bit more flex of we can be really lean, we can be a little bit more frugal. So to answer your question more plainly, I think it really depends. Are you building your own pipeline internally, or are you scaling and becoming a services model? Which is actually not, and this might be a hot take as an investor, it's not a bad model. I think we get a lot of pushback because companies think we need to build assets, but
Mhm.
sometimes the services models, if you have a truly proprietary service,
Mhm.
is quite a good business as well. I think it really just depends on what you're working on.
Interesting, because that's kind of a good segue into my next question. Because I remember talking to one investor, and they were saying how a lot of investments being made in large investments, and but like this plan for commercialization is not really deeply thought about, and they're kind
Mhm.
of like, oh, we'll figure it out along the way, or like as things progress. And I guess just by the nature of deep tech startups, it's like very hard to know your final kind of target customer profile and your business plan. But with the introduction of this kind of and rise of much more kind of like the incorporation of AI and the digital biology startups, I feel like the path to IPO, and this might be, correct me if I'm wrong, the path to IPO and acquisition is kind of less clear than in traditional biotech, where, there's an asset, the big pharma buys it,
Mhm.
etc.
Mhm.
How do you think about likely exit scenarios in
Yeah,
this
this is
space?
a really, really great question because this is why a lot of investors want to focus on assets, is because it's kind of murky what that exit profile looks like. Let me give you like two different examples. So let's take an AI first company that has assets. Prometheus is an example of that. They got sold to Merck for about 10 billion. If you look at the transaction notes, it's a little bit unclear, but most of it was valued in the assets still. So that's kind of giving you a framework. Okay, if you are building your pipeline, you're going to be valued based on the assets. We all know the traditional types of exits there. On the flip side, Tempest is another example. No assets. They spun out Pathos, but that's a completely different company. So no assets, and they IPO'd, and now I think their market cap is about 7 billion. So I think that's the creme de la creme example of an exit that doesn't have any assets. Why did that work so well? Huge proprietary data set, started way, way before a lot of real world companies were working in this space, and then got a stronghold not only in clinical, in commercial, in late stage, in med affairs, so targeting multiple steps within the pharma value chain. So I think Tempest is one really great example. To answer your question more cleanly, though, I don't think we have a really great way
Mhm.
of modeling exits here because there have been so few precedents. I think that will grow with time. Data Vant is another example of a company, I think about 3 or 4 billion valued right now. So it'll come with time. I think right now we just need to stay hopeful and
Mhm.
use Tempest and similar companies in that space as at least a bare starting point for now.
Fair. You mentioned proprietary data sets, which is, I think, is also becoming huge. I see a lot of smaller startups trying to come up with their new. I think there was one neurotech startups that's focused on generating the best kind of the fMRI data sets for clinical application, um, and much more in this space. How do you assess the defensibility of biological data sets in an area where like cloud labs, open science movements, and kind of federated learning are accelerating access to raw biological information? I believe like one of them is Arc Institute. Is they're recently they released this virtual cell model, if I'm not mistaken, and etc. So how do you take that into consideration?
Yeah. This is actually something I've been thinking through a lot, so I appreciate you asking this. The way I see this world headed is the big players, the big models are just going to get bigger through consolidation and their access to compute. So Arc, Isomorphic, Syra, like these are the kind of levels of companies that have both the funding to acquire data and also to just generally run their models at a large scale. So what I've done now is analyze each of those models, see where they have data deficiencies, and then go evaluate companies that are building specifically in that space. Let me give you some examples. AlphaFold, for example, cannot do protein dynamic modeling very well. They have static structures. So any sort of light microscopy or temporal data you can feed into that model will be very interesting. AlphaGenome, for example, cannot reason over methylation data or unique epigenetic data sets. So finding a company that's building in that space is going to be very interesting. Who else? Like Arc is right now single cell perturbation models. How do we extend that even further to understanding organ level or
Tissue level.
tissue level dynamics? And so companies that are building in that space will be very interesting to Arc. So that's kind of the framework I use is let's find where the big models are failing. I don't care about another company that's building, interesting protein binding data sets. There's a lot of folks working in that space. It's got to be really unique that another big model cannot replicate or easily produce.
I understand. And one thing though, what I notice in especially in AI companies, you see more and more acquihires, where they hired essentially the founding team instead of like buying the company, right? Do you think that kind of thing might become normal in deep tech acquisitions too? And how does that affect like the venture capital ecosystem essentially?
Yeah, I think that is going to become quite normalized, right? Like if you think about it, there's major consolidation in the regular biotech pharma world. Similar is probably going to happen in the deep tech X bio world. How do we think through that from a venture lens? This goes back to your same point on exits. There aren't really great precedents here, and I think that will come with time. But if you look at Recursion's like acquisitions, they're 50 mil each. These are tiny, tiny exits. Obviously, those have been over years. They've started like 3-4 years ago. We're living in a different time now. So yeah, I don't think I have a perfect answer to your question, other that it will take some time. It'll take a few acquisitions to kind of set the benchmarks. And then we'll see from there.
I'm going to ask this one because it ties to that point you made. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of data sets, and you said you don't care about some of them. You care about the ones that are not being sold by this large incumbents companies. One thing though, I feel like, and I remember having a conversation, and they were telling me how there's a lot of kind of hype, but I feel like sometimes there's misconception, kind of misjudgment of founders on how quickly those computational insights can translate into validated clinical outcomes, right? What kind of misconceptions, misjudgments do you see? Do you hear about? Do you, I guess, experience too?
Yeah, great question. I think the biggest misconception is that just because you've created an interesting protein folding model does not mean you find therapeutic outcomes that actually impact patients, right? That the steps to get there are so long. I think a lot of times founders and big companies are just focused in R&D. And the way to actually utilize AI more efficiently is to think across the entire value chain. Think about ways to optimize clinical trials, patient stratification, perhaps digital twins, which so many companies are doing now for late stage trials. Then you get to CMC. Let's say you get through clinical. How do I think through actually increasing yield if it's a biologics product, or creating more small molecule efficiencies in my CMC manufacturing setting? Then you get to commercial. This is a whole world no one ever thinks about, because I think few people who've worked in deep R&D understand it. Think about ways to win market share through sales and marketing tactics. Think about ways to get more direct to HCP messaging and marketing. These are all things I think we forget about because we're so interested in the sexy science, which is a great thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes you forget there's a world that comes beyond just building interesting targets and molecules. Taking them to clinic obviously is the biggest battle, but even beyond that, in manufacturing, process development, commercialization, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that AI and computation can help with, and problems that a lot of great founders sometimes don't think through as the first top of mind thing.
One thing you touched upon is really interesting at the new business models, right? The commercial side of things. I feel like with the rise of new technologies, you always kind of end up seeing new ways of selling them to the market too. One that was really interesting to me is open evidence. I believe they don't really have a commercial business unit. It was more so like the word of mouth, and it is becoming like an infrastructure for a lot of doctors in the US. What are some of the interesting business models have you noticed in deep tech biotech world?
Interesting question. So I'll talk twofold here. One will be in manufacturing, and the second will be in like commercialization and services. Um, in manufacturing, I think there's interesting models where you're either selling some sort of materials play, you're actually gaining royalties on an end product. Like an example would be TriLink, which is a really old company. They get royalties on the mRNA caps they produce. So you get royalties on the end products through that. It's an interesting model where you're not actually creating the finished product, but you're creating a component of it. And then you get, of course, the margins based on that. Another model within manufacturing is you just become a standalone CDMO, integrate AI and technology into that, and then you become like more of a brick and mortar establishment, which is very different from a lot of the ways tech and biology companies think. On the commercialization side, I think there's some interesting ploys where you think through a wraparound service organization. Um, these are all companies I should mention that don't have their own assets, right? These are more computationally driven services companies. So think of a wraparound service organization. I had a really interesting call with the founder focusing on, I won't name the specific disease, but wraparound services for that disease through patient stratification, through early diagnosis, prognosis tools. So think actually through more of a clinical model rather than a traditional pharma model. So those are just a few that come top of mind. I think within the asset-driven world, it's a little bit harder to be creative with business models because you are ultimately selling and partnering on
Mhm.
the drug. But outside that space, there's a lot of unique room to play around with things.
Mhm. Going back to your point about computation models and data sets, AI is improving fast, and with AI, computational models in biology improve too. Do you think experimental validation will become the primary bottleneck? And I guess if so, what business models can solve that? What kind of integration, wet lab, computation integration can solve that?
Mhm. I don't think the biggest bottleneck is going to be experimentation. It's going to be data and compute.
Oh, okay.
So I think those are going to be much bigger hurdles to cross. I think it's awesome what these companies are doing with virtual scientists and with like experimentation methods. A lot of times, though, pharma is already building that in house. What is more useful from those companies is the large amount of data they're able to produce, whether it's chemical synthesis data or interesting, ADMET data through assays. That is really, really going to be the Goldilocks, the kind of gold pot at the end of the tunnel. So, yeah, I don't actually think wet lab and experimentation is going to be the hurdle. At some point, we're going to tap it out of building right models to help perform some of these experimentation methods. And I think what needs to be worked on, a pipeline needs to be worked on, is in the data and compute space more so than on the experimentation side.
Interesting. Very interesting. And I got to ask this old age question. And I'm really interested, especially now. I'm interested about your thoughts. When evaluating opportunities, right? How do you assess whether to back a platform technology with many applications, or like single high probability kind of single application startup?
Mm. I think you have to have a beachhead market. So that's first use case needs to be really, really exciting. But then you always need to have like, what's the next organization you can tap. To your point, it doesn't have to be novel technologies. It doesn't have to be a different tech play as your second product. It could even be, I'm starting off in phase 4 line extension trials in pharma. Then I want to use a similar product, but shift it for phase 1 products, assets and trials. So I think you need to have a strategy of how you create from that first product. But it doesn't always need to be interesting new tech. It can just be reframing it for a different purpose within the pharma value chain. But yeah, that's kind of how I
Fair.
evaluate companies.
I took a look at your napkin list. That's actually when I decided to reach out to you, and it was really interesting. Very cool ideas spanning AI, wet lab biology, policy, manufacturing, which is, I feel like, is becoming huge in the US. The focus on manufacturing, especially in the US, is huge. If you sort of had a chance, an opportunity, hypothetical opportunity to accelerate one of the themes you had on your napkin list to full maturity tomorrow,
Yeah,
which one do you think would most profoundly change industry and why?
great question. Manufacturing, for sure. And I'm saying this right now in this macroeconomic climate. I won't speak to any of my political beliefs, but the world is rapidly changing in the stronghold of biotech. Like, you can argue one way or the other, the US is always the stronghold of biotech. With incoming policy changes, as we're all familiar with tariffs, onshoring of manufacturing, this is a huge white space that if a company can tackle and really get ahead of, it will be exponential in terms of growth and end product result. So I think to think through that end to end, first thing we need is more capacity. So literally, facilities, brick and mortar systems, as I was thinking through. Second thing is, at some point we tap out of capacity. The US is only so big. How do we make those facilities more efficient? That's where AI, tech, novel next gen sensors, interesting new formulation techniques or bioprocessing techniques come in. And then the last is, how do we think through competing from a country to country perspective? The US is majorly focused, a lot of these changes are out competing other global competitors. And so if we're really able to get ahead in terms of building these facilities on US soil, I think we'll get ahead of global competition as well if we really do it right. So yeah, I think that's one space. You just look at so many policy changes there, but also so much need for innovation. Um, I think if we tackle it right, we can be eons ahead of getting the right products to the right patients.
As somebody who has very much a bi-coastal experience in investing and startups, how do you think Europe will, play a role in especially in this, as you said, shifting dynamics and shifting landscape?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the thing about this administration is very hard to even think through. Makes my job as a venture capitalist very hard because it's hard to even predict what comes next. So I don't think I have a great answer there. What I will say is there is amazing academic research that will continue to share between borders in the US and Europe. So I think continuing to be leaders in certain spaces. I spent a lot of time here in the UK in Cambridge, Oxford, and then obviously the London universities. There's just some really cutting edge technology that can be used for manufacturing, defense related applications. And they have deep partnerships with their US counterparts and universities. So I think continuing to build on those sister to sister academic relationships, continuing to think through ways to foster blue skies thinking between organizations. I think that's really going to be the major place that a lot of these new technologies have come from. I can't speak to what happens when they actually get to a company stage or when to get to some of these dynamics of, are American companies going to be excited about European private markets? I don't know. I can't speak to that, but I think there's still a huge world within the academic realm that will continue to grow and thrive in Europe.
As a follow-up question to that, as you very much right to point out, like I believe quarter of the scientific publication comes from Europe, but obviously in terms of capital, that's where the main lag is happening. There's a lot of focus on Europe now, in Europe, obviously, this Project Europe, etc. Where like there's very much, it's still more software focused, but there's push to invest more, to build more European startups and companies. Are you seeing any sort of similar sentiment in the deep tech biotech space in Europe, or is it very much like the old fashioned way continues the same way?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's a few things that are happening now. I come from a very UK mindset, just being based here, but I mean, NATO is putting in a ton of work in mainland Europe. ARIA here in the UK is majorly funding a lot of deep tech and biology research. So I think there are larger institutions that are coming together now with this grand purpose of accelerating both research and commercialization. You're completely right, though, where the stop happens is beyond like a Series B. So I see these amazing companies getting great traction from European investors at a seed and Series A. At a Series B, they need large checks, and there's not that many funds that are able to do that, or even government related institutions that are able to do that. They try to make it back in the US. They don't have any contacts or networks there because their syndicates at seed and Series A have been European primarily. So that's kind of where I see a lot of companies struggling. The good ones make it. I think maybe some of them get left behind, but most of the good ones make it. I think what we need to think through, and a lot of what I really enjoyed being here, was creating those cross bridges at very early stages. So American funds taking a look at companies at seed Series A, being in on those amazing European syndicates. That way, when they are able to write the major growth round checks, they already have an into those companies and are able to help them scale. So I think that's kind of the missing link that some funds are doing. There are quite a few American funds that have set up shop here, but not as many as you'd expect, especially to capitalize on some of the arbitrage values here.
Fair. I'm sure there's some of them that you cannot mention and they should remain confidential, but I'm just still curious. I'm going to ask it. Are there any startups or companies that you're really excited about right now?
Yeah, I can't speak to specific startups, but maybe what I can speak to is areas that these startups are building in. And I kind of spoke to this before. I'm really excited about startups that are building in the white spaces that big models can't build. There's quite a few startups I'm looking at on like whole organ modeling and tissue level modeling. So taking that virtual cell to one other step. There's a whole bunch of companies I'm looking at in protein dynamic modeling, whether that's through a quantum-based approach. There's a really interesting article that just got released on actually using just normal X-ray crystallography data to understand protein dynamics. So I think those are a couple areas where I've seen quite a few companies that I'm interested in. I'm also very passionate about women's health. We just did a women's health investment and really excited about. Can't speak too much detail there, but that's a whole broad space that a lot of companies are innovating and building in. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't think I can speak to the specific names, but just some general concepts I'm very excited about.
I'm really curious though. You said white spaces is big companies are not building or haven't built in yet. Just purely instinctively, like thinking about the amount of the firepower they have, right? In terms of scientific power, backing the funds, infrastructure. Why are they not doing? Why are they not pursuing those ideas? Is it more bureaucracy thing, or is they just not really interested in that because it doesn't really fit the agenda they have? Like, why do you think those big companies are not focusing on those white spaces?
They are, but I think they've realized the cost and value of acquiring is much
Mm,
lower than building in house. So I
mm,
think they are thinking through these ideas, which is why the companies I'm speaking to are going to be successful, is because
mm,
the big companies are thinking through these spaces. The amount of time it takes to actually rebuild the tech
mm,
a lot of these small companies have built is ginormous, and the staff you'd have to hire, etc. So it's much easier just to acquire or to buy data off of
mm.
other companies.
So how do you look at so many different technologies, so many very deep science technologies? How do you manage to assess? Because obviously you will never know as well as this scientist founder because they've been working probably in the space for a very long time. But how do you manage to know enough to make like a confident
Mm.
investment decision?
Yeah. Great question. And you're so right. I think any investor who says they know the space better than the founder is probably very rare to find. um, I think a few things that I can provide in value. First is just the number of companies I'm seeing. So that competitive outlook. I obviously can't share details on what the specific companies are building, but I can say, I've seen other companies in this space. They're doing XYZ. Explain to me how this is different or how you'd beat them. Secondly, would be an overview and understanding of markets, especially having worked in pharma. This is how much pharma would be willing to pay. Maybe we think through a different lens where they'd be able to pay a little bit more if you expanded your use case. And that has a lot of credit comes to being at Genentech for those years and actually building up and understanding the internal workings of a company like that. And then the last thing is using the KOLs and experts within my network. Even if I don't personally understand the subject area 100%, I will most likely be able to find a professor, an ex-Genentech colleague, or even just someone I've met through interesting events who is deeply knowledgeable in this space and who can help me work through and understand some of the technical parameters. So yeah, that's usually the framework I use. Is there's still value add. It's not necessarily deep dive into the specific tech nuances. I can read through and understand a high level. But there's other ways I can provide value, and there's other resources I can use to help drill in a little bit deeper.
Fair. One question I forgot to ask though is that obviously there's constant generation of data and everything's becoming very much digitized and computerized. I feel like the issue of reproducibility is becoming kind of more apparent in science. Do you think at some point we'll eventually see sort of like a standard operating system for biology in terms of common set of data formats, lab protocols, and simulation frameworks, or will proprietary tools remain in the silos?
Great. Yeah, good thought provoking question. I don't think we're going to see that world anytime soon. You know, the way data is standardized between even large pharma companies, between Genentech and Pfizer, for example, completely different. The types of ontology used. Obviously, there are some common frameworks, but it looks so different between organization to organization. The reason why I don't think we will see a standard operability set is because we are so hesitant to work on these consortiums. Right? There's a few data consortiums that are really exciting, like OpenBind is a great example of that. I think until we get to a point where data sharing is a lot more open and transparent, we're not going to get to better interoperability between data systems. And I understand it, right? A lot of the moats that these companies are building are based on their data. So why would they go out willy-nilly and share between companies? We live in a capitalist world, so that's always going to remain. But yeah, I don't think we will get there anytime in the near future, at least while the competition between a lot of these major players is still hot and heavy right now.
Fair. We're coming towards the end of our episode, so I'm going to ask you two questions, more kind of philosophical reflection based. One would be, what general advice would you have for someone, for people who are interested in deep tech investing, but they don't know where to start? Maybe they're a student, maybe they're PhD, masters, undergrad, etc., or maybe they've been working in startups and want to move to the other side. What advice would you have for those people?
Yeah. Maybe I'll frame it from if you're in academia angle, and then if you're in corporate angle. If you're in academia, I would say take advantage of fellowships as much as you can. And you can do those while you're in your PhD or in your master's. A lot of them are unpaid, but they're really, really great opportunities to even understand what the world of venture is. So I would say do that. Go to as many events as you can, which is obviously a common piece of advice. The last piece is similar to what we're speaking to with some of my writings. Like, write and think through your own ideas. Have a thesis in mind. Maybe think of a couple companies that fit within that thesis that you would want to go approach. So have that pre-ready. Whether or not you're actually like doing the investing role, at least have some writings or thesis ready when you're discussing with investors. For folks in corporate, there's actually, especially in Europe, there's quite a lot of pushback on folks who come from maybe like my background, pharma, commercial, or not very traditional deep tech academic backgrounds. there's still huge value in what you bring. So I think number one thing is I would say, don't be dissuaded. It's okay to feel like, oh my gosh, no one wants to talk to me because I don't have a PhD. I get that feeling. But at the same time, there's so much value you can bring. And what I would utilize here is your network, especially if you've worked in large pharma or biotech. Your network in this space is more valuable than you realize. So when you're talking to investors, think about your friend who's just starting a company. Think about, your ex-colleague in pharma who, was working on a really interesting internal project. Those are the kind of conversations you can have with folks and bring a lot of value to. At the end of the day, all these companies in the space we're speaking out are selling to pharma. If you have connections and you
Mhm.
have insights into those kind of businesses, that's very, very hard to garner from just word on the street. So yeah, I would say it is a weird space. It is also not an industry for everyone. I think getting your foot in the door and understanding if you even want to do it long term is a great first step, because it's not what it looks like on paper or through blogs, etc.
Very interesting. I guess final question would be, and it's more philosophical, but which do you fear more as an investor? Backing a scientifically beautiful companies that never scales commercially, or passing on ones that later becomes transformative?
I fear the second
Mm,
more. Missing a potential unicorn is probably one of the worst feelings as an investor, especially if you've spoken to them and you had the chance to meet them. There's obviously you don't want this, but there will be some bad bets in your portfolio. That's just bound to happen. But missing a potential golden opportunity, um, maybe you didn't think the team was strong enough. Maybe you didn't think the tech was strong enough. But they go on and be very, very successful is a worse feeling, and not a failure, because they're, venture at the end of the day is all predictive analytics. But I would say missing a plus is worse than hitting a negative.
fair. Thank you so much, Sonal. It was a wonderful episode and wonderful insights. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, great to be here and chat with you.